to the Burn Bag podcast. My name is Andre Gonawala. Today, we are delighted to be joined by former Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper. Director Clapper served as DNI between 2010 and 2017 under the Obama administration. Again, the Director of National Intelligence essentially oversees the intelligence community at large. Director Clapper also served as Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence between 2007 and 2010. He was also director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency between 2001 and 2006, the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency between 1991 and 1995, and Director Clapper is also a retired Lieutenant General in the US Air Force. Again, an incredible resume, sterling qualifications across the intelligence community. Today, we're going to be talking to Director Clapper about the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the war, and the US response to it. So Director Clapper, we're so honored to have you join us here today.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So Director Clapper, as Andre mentioned, we're going to be talking about the renewed Russo-Ukrainian War. Of course, this is not a kind of a renewed conflict. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. There's been an ongoing conflict in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. Nonetheless, there's been a heightened response by the United States, by the NATO allies, and essentially the world, much of the world, has responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I want to begin by asking you how you assess the U.S. response. Has the Biden administration performed well during this conflict, in your opinion?
Well, I think on balance, yes, it has. And for me, the obvious comparison is with 2014, the previous Russian incursion when I was the DNI. And I think by and large, they've responded very well. I played the hand that they were dealt pretty well. I mean, we can do the coulda, woulda, shouldas all day long about it should have done more earlier. Should have let those Polish MiGs go. You can argue those kinds of things all day long. But I think the amount of aid that we were providing to the Ukrainians, we and NATO countries as well, is pretty impressive. Tony Blinken was on State of the Union yesterday on CNN and quoted the statistic. In fact, I had seen him coincidentally Friday afternoon when I was at the State Department, and quoted the statistic that there was almost 11 javelins for every known tank of the Russians in Ukraine. So now that sounds impressive, but as we've seen with the countless highways of death pictures, images of destroyed Russian tanks and vehicles, you can use up a lot of javelins pretty fast, and stingers for that matter. So I think the question now is, can we sustain it? Now I think there's every prospect of a defeat, frankly, for the Russians, and it's going to be very dependent on our continued assistance. But to answer your question, by and large, I think they've done very well.
So sort of going back to the beginning of this war, was the war a foregone conclusion? Was Russia going to launch a full-scale offensive regardless of the US or Western response?
Yeah, I think it was. I don't think there's any way. When the Russians deployed that many troops, something like 70% of their conventional ground forces, and on three sides of Ukraine, and let them sit there for quite a while, I didn't see any way, no matter what we did diplomatically, that would preclude the Russians from invading. So yeah, I think we had to play that out, do what we could, and I think the administration did, attempting to negotiate with the Russians, but they're not in the mode to negotiate. They weren't before the invasion, and they aren't now.
So it really appears, I guess, if you're looking at much of the media, much of the reporting coming out of this conflict, that Russia seems to be losing the war, or at least Ukraine is potentially not losing. And so there are reports of low morale amongst the Russian military. There are, in some cases, mutiny. You have Russian soldiers kind of going against their officers. I guess, Director Clapper, the first question is, there's a lot of information coming out of this conflict. And of course, it's subject to misinformation or disinformation. And so how much of this should we believe? Should we have some kind of conscious wariness when we're kind of looking at all this information? Because on the one hand, it's certainly a ground war and an air war, but also an information war.
Well, it is, and I think, yeah, I think we can trust what's coming out, mainly because it's coming out from so many different sources that are mutually corroborative. For me, a historical first, I'll give you one example what I'm talking about here. For historical first was Jeremy Fleming, who is director of the Government Communications Headquarters, which is the UK's equivalent to our National Security Agency. I don't recall ever a director of GCHQ speaking out about substantive issues, talk about cybersecurity or communication security and all that, but not something like this where he made substantive calls about the Russians' poor performance, which, to me is corroborative of everything else we're hearing from the media. And of course, you can see it. This is a television war, no question about it. Network I'm associated with, CNN, has heavily covered the war. Excuse me here just a minute. And so I think it's valid. Now, I think your bigger question is the information war. It is that. The Russians have an information operations campaign going, particularly in their own country, which we need to penetrate. And what is very novel in this instance is our use of our intelligence as a weapon against the Russians, diming them out beforehand on actions that they apparently were contemplating taking. So this is indeed an information operations war. And for my part, at least, I think what we're seeing in the mainstream media, if you will, and the foreign media is pretty accurate.
So over the weekend, we saw some horrific images coming from the town of Bucha. Essentially, Russian troops had massacred a lot of Ukrainian civilians. That has led to, of course, more calls for the US and the West to, I guess, intensify their engagement. But of course, there is always that sort of looming possibility of a nuclear war, which many people are afraid of, and which, of course, would limit our ability to respond to, such egregious war crimes, essentially. Director, how would you consider for us to essentially, can we intensify our engagement with this? How can we stop these crimes from occurring when that nuclear question looms so large?
Well, obviously calling attention to them, having them investigated and all that, but short of, a direct intervention by U.S. military forces in an effort to, assist the Ukrainians, that's pretty tough. I tell you, I've thought a lot about contrasting my situation right now, with what the situation I've confronted in 2014. And when you're sitting in the White House Situation Room and you're deliberating, or the policymakers are, role of intelligence obviously is to support the policymaking. That's one thing. It's quite another to be an armchair pundit like I am now, and it's easy to be more assertive, more aggressive. We ought to do this, we ought to do that. But if you're actually sitting there and you're part of the collective group that is trying to make determinations and weigh the risk of a nuclear war, or the use of, even below that, just the use of tactical nuclear weapons, it's a heavy thing. So the president stated early on, we're not going to intervene militarily. Personally, I wish he hadn't done that. I wish we'd preserved a little bit of strategic ambiguity there and has not said anything about it, even though, I mean, he said out loud, which is the fact, which he's prone to do. So we've sort of lost that threat, however vague it may have been, of actually intervening. I think if we see more evidence of Russian withdrawals and these horrible atrocities, there'll be more and more pressure for some form of humanitarian no-fly zone, I would guess. Whether we'll do that or not, I don't know. I think one thing we have learned, and I've spoken to this and written about it, which is, gauging will to fight. And we have never done that very well. Going back to my war, Southeast Asia, we profoundly underestimated the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, overestimated the South Vietnamese. Fast forward to Desert Storm, I was serving as Chief of Air Force Intelligence then. We profoundly overestimated the will to fight of the Iraqis, to include the vaunted Republican Guards. Afghanistan profoundly underestimated the will to fight of the Taliban, overestimated the government. And now we have difficulty once again gauging will to fight. I would contend that it is almost impossible to predict how a military force, starting with the individual soldier on up to units as a team, will perform under actual combat conditions. So we really overestimated the Russians and underestimated the will to fight of the Ukrainians.
So, Director Clapper, I certainly want to get into Ukraine's incredible defense, but I do want to ask about the no-fly zone that you mentioned, a humanitarian no-fly zone. There's a lot of controversy around instituting kind of such a measure, but I think for the benefit of us and our listeners, what would a no-fly zone really entail? And, why is it controversial? And how could it be kind of carried out?
Well, it's having some experience in supporting no-fly zones, Operation Southern Comfort, for example. First of all, a no-fly zone is not a trivial undertaking. And, to take it literally, you are trying to suppress all flying activity over a very fluid battlefield. And so I think one problem you'd have, I mean, it's you can overcome it, but it's a challenge. It'd be deconflicting with the Ukrainians to make sure they're not flying or they're not shooting at you. And of course, there is the concern about a direct confrontation with Russians. And, the first time we shoot a Russian aircraft down or they shoot one of ours down, then, are we into it with a wider war? I don't know that's the case, so that'll actually happen or not. But that's the concern. But they running a no-fly zone is very resource intensive, because you got to do it 7x24. You have to cover the entire area in question, and for that matter, surrounding areas. This would require coordination with all the surrounding countries, coordination with the Ukrainians to make sure you don't do fratricide where you shoot yourself, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, and then you'd have to have base rights, in it to enable whoever's participating in the no-fly arrangement. Is it just the U.S. or NATO nations? Then you have the international coordination to sustain it, and you're going to sustain a no-fly zone indefinitely, day after day, week after week, month after month. Is extremely resource intensive. So just from the standpoint of the management of one and the manpower and resource intensiveness of it, it is not a trivial thing, let alone all the other complications.
So, Director Clapper, in your previous answer, you mentioned the inability to oftentimes predict the will to fight in the armed forces of different countries. You talked about our inability to predict the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese, the Iraqi troops in Desert Storm, and then, of course, the fact that we could not necessarily predict the will to fight of the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. But that sort of leads me to a follow-up question on the part of Vladimir Putin, because when we're now retrospectively looking back at the beginning of this war and how it sort of proceeded and just the mounting Russian casualties, it appears to be a huge miscalculation for Putin. I mean, were his assumptions just incorrect? Was he provided incorrect information? Did he overestimate the will to fight of his own army? Or, I mean, does he even care? Would he have just done this?
Well, I think he cares. No question about that. But I think it's a good question, by the way. I think, first of all, he's been in relative isolation for about 22 years, as long as he has been in some position of control, of influence. So he's been isolated bureaucratically, administratively for about 22 years, and physically for the last 2 with the pandemic. You know, we've seen these images of meeting people at the length of a table, the length of a football field, sort of thing. So he's very isolated. Like all autocrats, very difficult for bad news to be conveyed to him. So most all autocrats don't have people surrounding them that are going to convey the bad news. And this is particularly true with Putin. So I think he's been kind of in a bubble, reality bubble, for quite some time. And I think he got caught up as well with all the big investments that the Russians have made in reforming their military, notably their army, smaller, leaner, more agile, better equipped, etc. And I think the Russians didn't have a plan B. I think they thought all they had to do was drive into Ukraine, and the Ukrainians would be throwing rose petals in the street and handing out salt bread to the victorious Russians. And when that didn't work, obviously, when the Ukrainians resisted stiffly, the Russians really weren't expecting that at all. And proof of that is the fact with their 3 or 4 avenues of approach, as they call it in the military, they did not muster sufficient combat power in any one of them in order to do what they intended to do, which is not only roll through Ukraine, but control what they rolled through. In other words, actually control the populations that they enveloped. Well, they had nearly the force posture to do that. I guess they assumed away logistics somehow, which have been abysmal. They appear not to have a theater commander, an overall commander who's in charge of all these various forces that have invaded Ukraine. And of course, the morale is terrible. And, a large part of their manpower is conscripts, which, by the way, are in the process of turning over now. So on several levels, I think the Russians really were disillusioned about their own capacity and their own capabilities. And I think they expected they're going to roll through the streets of Kyiv in no time flat and install a puppet government, seize the government buildings, install a puppet government, and take the rest of the day off. Well, didn't quite work that way. And I think the Russians were a whole bunch of assumptions they made that weren't valid.
So if we think about kind of more broadly what Putin and the Kremlin and basically the Russian government and military are looking to kind of do with this, what they call a special operations mission, I mean, it's really just an offensive. What do you see as being the end goal? Of course, this might have changed as we've kind of seen that Russia's been essentially kind of beat to the punch when they're going through Kyiv. But is the goal here now, are they regrouping to still take the whole country? Are they still looking to maybe install a puppet regime, or are they just more so looking now to reinvigorate the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbas region, where there's separatists? Do they have broader goals? I know I've seen many analysts say that, they're looking to the Baltics next, they're looking to Belarus, they're looking to Moldova. Of course, no one really knows other than Putin and the most high-ranking Russians. But given your experiences in dealing with the Russians, where do you see this potentially going?
Well, you have to take seriously what Putin has said, and the meandering paper that he wrote supposedly last July. So, Putin is a throwback, not to just the Soviet era, but he's a throwback to the czars, I believe. So he has this mystical, he's a religious statist, I'll put it that way. I think that's how I describe it, where there are religious overtones to his worship of the state. And this is, again, is more czar-like than anything else. So he's said, he wants to roll back things back to 1997, pre-NATO expansion. None of the Eastern European countries should be in NATO, et cetera, et cetera. And, he wants to restore Russian greatness. Well, taken to its illogical extreme, that means the Baltics, it means the likes of Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, et cetera. So what he's going to do now, I think his military capacity to actually do that is already profoundly impaired. He just doesn't have wouldn't have the military wherewithal, and he certainly doesn't have. If he had there was actually a standoff between NATO and Russia. That doesn't bode well for him. It really doesn't. But again, you have this visionary, this mystical illusion versus what are the facts on the ground. Because I think he fully intended not to stop with just Ukraine. Had he just rolled through town like he thought and installed a puppet government in Kyiv, I think Moldova was next, another non-nation country, and then the Baltics after that. I believe that the Kaliningrad enclave in Poland is a thorn in his side, and I think he would have done something about that. But now, with his military capacity, I think profoundly impaired, and it looks like as long as he keeps this up in the Ukraine, he's just going to continue to lose more forces. And so the Russians now, all they can do is fall back on what they're famous for, which is bombardment, and just mindlessly bomb civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, nurseries, orphanages, etc., because it's what they can do. Certainly on a military face-off basis, they can't win.
So actually following up on that question, when we, from the views of casual observers, for example, they might see that the ground troops that Russia is deploying have been very ineffective. They haven't been able to really take any major cities or hold them for extended periods of time. And then what we're really seeing a lot of these casualties really mount from is these airstrikes, the Russian Air Force basically coming in. And sort of from your experience in the US Air Force, what's your take? Has the Russian Air Force been effective in denting Ukrainian morale? Of course, there are a lot of military theories that have to do with sort of airstrikes in Vietnam and so on. But is the Russian Air Force actually effective where the ground troops are not?
Well, it hasn't been because it hasn't achieved air superiority. That's the first thing you want to do is in a confrontation like this is achieve air superiority. So you've got free range of the skies. Well, I think they took too much of a cue from their experience in Syria, where there really wasn't any resistance. And so the fact they haven't done that, and they've lost a lot of aircraft, I guess. And the other point, I honestly don't know what the relative proportion is of targets hit from the air versus targets hit from artillery, missiles, rockets, etc. I don't know the relative proportion there. But just from what I am able to observe, it doesn't look like the Russian Air Force has been very effective. And they've used, first line aircraft.
So Director Clapper, there's a lot of speculation as to what it's like really inside of Russia and in Russian power centers in particular, such as the oligarchs, the Kremlin, the security services, the military. There's been high-level officials being allegedly arrested or put under house arrest, or I guess, quote unquote, disappearing. But I want to ask you, is there an actual fear within maybe the Kremlin, or should Putin actually fear a threat such as a palace coup, or I guess, quote unquote, from above? Because I mean, realistically, in my assessment, and I think, I guess, for many others who look at Russia, there is a limited one from below just because of how strong the security services are and how they've basically just dismantled civil society.
Well, yeah, I think all autocrats got to be looking over their shoulder all the time, for that matter. And this is one of the problems that he has, I think. Although I'm not sure he realizes it, when you're isolated in an ivory tower like he is, to me, he's the classic example of the emperor hath no clothes. Now, I don't really think right now there's any real, and I could be completely wrong about this, but I don't think there's any real concern that there's going to be a coup. And I think, again, pretty graphic evidence of this is just the demeanor of his subordinates, and the way he publicly humiliated Narishkin, who I think is SVR chief. And if that's standard fare when you meet with the great man, I think for the most part, they're pretty cowed. So, and the other point is that this close inner circle with the likes of Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, Patrushev, whom I've met as a nominal national security advisor, Bortnikov, the FSB chief, Narishkin even, they've been with him for years. And so I think the likelihood of one of them fomenting a coup is pretty slim. Now, I think more likely it's some group, Young Turks, whatever, that we never heard of. That I think that's more likely. The oligarchs, I had thought initially maybe they could bring some pressure to bear on him, because what's happening, particularly with the economic isolation, this hurts the oligarchs. But again, I don't think he's learned the mechanisms for controlling them as well, mainly the money. So I just think right now the prospects for some sort of coup, whether bloodless or not, are kind of remote.
So recently, President Biden said off the cuff that Putin must go. And since then, White House officials have somewhat walked back on that statement. But should the president have said that? Is that the only realistic solution to ensure peace?
I spoke to that on CNN. I have a contrarian view. I mean, President Biden is President Biden. He wears his emotions on his sleeve. He just said what he thought, and he also said what a lot of people think. And my comment was that by attempting to walk it back, what that infers is that we're okay with having a war criminal as the head of state in Russia. So I sort of didn't agree with the criticism. I didn't see any problem. I don't think it implied regime change. And so what if it did? That's what's on everybody's mind anyway.
Speaking of criticisms of President Biden, there was a huge amount of criticism and a lot with many former members of the IC about the intelligence disclosures. And this was a strategy that I think, at least in my opinion, and that of probably many others, that has been quite effective. So essentially, the White House has strategically released intelligence about Russian movements, Russian plans. And as kind of Russia mobilized, this kind of maybe set them kind of off foot. And so I'm curious about how you see this strategy as a former DNI, someone who spent their career in intelligence. Was this somewhat of a limitation to Russia's strategic surprise?
Well, well, certainly it was. I think it was very distracting and very disruptive to the Russians when, particularly in the case of the false flags. Now, there's some formers who are very concerned about it, and understandably so. The crown jewels in the intelligence community are sources and methods and tradecraft. And so whenever there's a revelation, like we've done here, you can bet the Russians are going to back engineer and say, well, where did they get that? So there is that, and you have to weigh the risk versus gain. I've been critiqued for, gee, why didn't we do that in 2014? Well, for one thing, we didn't have the intelligence, and the technology is profoundly improved, particularly with respect to commercial imagery, and which is a lot more compelling than it was 8 years ago in 2014. The other factor I like to point out, at risk of sounding defensive, is the Russians were a hell of a lot more subtle in 2014 than they were now. They've been about as subtle as a freight train. I mean, we could see very obviously they're lining up, thanks to commercial imagery, what they were going to do before the war. And, they had the little green men, they had 10,000 naval infantry already on the Crimean Peninsula. So, and plus, another very important factor we have a tendency to overlook in comparing 2014 with now is the Ukrainian resistance, which wasn't much in 2014. So I think it shows the impacts of the security assistance that the Ukrainians have been provided, and notably the training by both the United States and NATO at large. So big difference.
So I'm just going to assume, since you were, of course, a senior level official in the Obama administration, I'm sure you had a lot of engagements with the Russian government, with your counterparts in the Russian government. And just to take us a bit maybe behind the scenes to 2014 and the length of the Obama administration. And then, of course, actually, even before then, how have you sort of seen the Russian government sort of change? And I guess that sort of practical experience that you had, as in, how have they changed when they're negotiating with you at that table? How have they changed in your interactions with senior level Russians as the Putin administration has, of course, matured and so on? Like, what are they like one-on-one when you're dealing with the Russian government?
Well, they are, they're duplicitous. And my first encounter with senior Russians was when I was director of DIA, I think about 1992. And, they're glad-handed, and, they do the ostensive administrative things. But when it comes down to actually bargaining and them holding their word, they don't. I mean, they'll say one thing, do another. That's just the way they are. They're duplicitous. They can't be trusted. And that's been my observation consistently from the Soviet Union through the fall of the wall and onward. And the behavior they're exhibiting now is very much the same as during the Cold War. So I was enjoined when I was director of DIA by Secretary of Defense to try to engage the Russians if I could generate some sort of intelligence exchange with the Russians. So we did. And I remember putting out, sending through the embassy in Moscow, I'll never forget this, a classification, secret releasable to Russia. And so we, in good faith, I mean, we didn't give anything real sensitive away, but in good faith attempted to exchange intelligence with them. And that is a one-way street. And they are in the receive and take mode, not in the transmit share mode at all. And and I think the behavior they're exhibiting now is consistent with that. They lie, and they have no compunction about that.
Yeah, I think there's a completely alternative worldview that Russia sees NATO, and the United States in particular is trying to just destroy Russia or institute some sort of regime change, which I think it's very clear that the United States is not seeking to destroy Russia, but certainly doesn't want it to invade other countries or completely dismantle the kind of international legal order we have. Nonetheless, there are a lot of other important players here. Of course, we have NATO, but also Russia's allies, such as China. And China, initially kind of took a hard stance that was kind of with Russia on this, but they've since kind of backed down, trying to find some sort of solution. I'm curious what your thoughts are about how Russia's relationship with China may be impacted by this conflict and just how of a good ally China may actually be.
Well, one question is whether Putin actually told the Chinese what he was going to do. I guess he did. So, either way, if he didn't, it doesn't speak too well. What I do think, and I've said this on CNN, I can't concede that Chinese would want any Chinese equipment, military equipment, to be seen on the Ukrainian battlefield and in any way assisting in these atrocities. I just can't concede the Chinese would be comfortable with that at all. So I think what the Chinese are going to do is kind of what they do with North Korea. They're going to do some things, and they haven't done a lot to, as far as I know, to break the sanctions or anything like that. I think they'll do some things, particularly if they can do it. They think they can do it surreptitiously. And it's much like the North Koreans. They'll do some things to play along with the international condemnation of the North Korean behavior, but they won't do enough that would cause North Korea to collapse. And so I think it's kind of the same approach I think they'll take with the Russians. They abstained. They could have voted against it, but they abstained against the condemnation vote in the Security Council of the United Nations. So I think they're uncomfortable with the behavior of the Russians.
So Ryan just used the term ally to describe China and Russia. In my view, that may be a bit of a liberal use of the term. Sorry, Ryan, but I do think that China and Russia are, of course, aligned. In your view, are China and Russia actually allies? I mean, of course, China is sort of, maintaining a little bit of distance from Russia in terms of how they're directly reacting to what we're seeing in Ukraine. And of course, China has its own goals with regards to Taiwan. But would you consider them actually to be allies?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't think they have their allies in the context of, say, the way we're allies with Europe, particularly Western Europe. Not sure they exactly have the same values. What is different about this latest round of togetherness, if I can call it that? I think they do share, and this is pre-invasion, they do share an aversion to the rules-based order, as it's called. It was actually established by essentially the United States at the apex of our power, which is right after World War II. And I think they chafe under the rules that we essentially imposed on the rest of the world. The fact that the international monetary system is really based on the dollar, well, that gives them gas pain, and they want another paradigm. And so I do think they do have that in common, and that's manifested itself with joint exercises, military exercises, and all that, and the Chinese buying Russian equipment. But I also believe there is historical enmity between the two. The Russians always been a bit nervous about all those Chinese and all that empty space in Siberia. It kind of makes it. I think it kind of makes the Russians instinctively nervous. So yeah, they're closer than they have been, but as intimate international partners like we are with, say, the UK or the Five Eyes or Germany or France or Italy, no, I don't think it's not like that.
So Director Clapper, I'm curious, I'm living in Washington, D.C., and I was walking around over the weekend, and I've seen more Ukrainian flags than I ever thought I would in D.C., and it's great. But it does kind of raise the question in my mind, why are Americans so united on this? So of course, there are conflicts that occur around the world. I'm just curious how this became something, and it's a great thing that it did, that Americans are kind of more or less uniting around, saying that this is not okay. The United States and NATO and the world needs to do something?
Well, I think again, the television images, I think the reporting from Ukraine has had a huge impact on world opinion, for that matter. So these atrocities, and then you see this heart-rending, gut-wrenching disruption and uprooting, the mindless killing, attacking a maternity hospital, killing a pregnant woman, that, regardless of your political persuasion, I think that just gets to the very basics of, being humans. And the Russians, I think, are behaving as subhumans. They're behaving like animals. And I think that's had a profound impact. And of course, the effect has been exactly the opposite of what Putin wanted. He's long sought to divide, wedges between and among NATO nations, and a wedge between the US and NATO. And he's had actually the opposite effect. What an amazing turn for Germany, for example. Now they're going to meet their 2% GDP funding level for their military, send all this lethal aid to the Ukrainians. So a big turn. And now, of course, I think that the European countries are really going to do something about achieving energy independence from Russia. So all the things that Putin didn't want are happening. And it has been a remarkable thing in our country, where it's sort of distracted, I'll say, from all the partisanship and polarization and divisiveness in this country. And the Congress behavior has been, on this issue, largely bipartisan. And the extreme far right has been, I think, kind of neutralized in that, those who are praising Russia and praising Putin and being sympathetic to the Russians because of the, aggressive, intimidating Ukrainians, which is ridiculous.
So speaking of public opinion, we have seen some public opinion polls come out of Russia, and I use those air quotes somewhat liberally. And some of those public opinion polls have said that the majority of the Russian population do support Vladimir Putin on this, and there is somewhat of a rally around the flag effect that one would see during wartime. Of course, Russia's economy has been battered by the international sanctions against it. But the ruble, I think, has somewhat stabilized nowadays. Are we to trust these polls? Is there a reason to think that, okay, the majority of the Russian population actually supports this? And how frequently are they being bombarded with some of these images or some of these war crimes, or at least even hearing about these failures? I mean, is the Russian population completely closed off? Are they somewhat closed off? Or are they somewhat aware, at least through
Well, I
media
think
and so on?
you have to understand the effect of decades of brainwashing, decades of internal propaganda. Now, and of course, the only media remaining left to operate in Russia are state-controlled outlets. They've closed down just about everybody else. So imagine if you're a Russian citizen and a pollster comes to you and asks your opinion about Vladimir Putin and his leadership. Are you going to be so bold as to say, rate him low? I don't think so. I think most Russians, so conditioned to Putin, are going to respond that way and respond in a way that keeps them out of trouble. So I take these polls with a grain of salt. I really do, and I acknowledge. I think there's one outfit called Levada or something like that that's supposed to be pretty credible. But I just think about the human aspect of if I'm approached by a pollster who promises anonymity, and protection and all that, some stranger that approaches me about asking my opinion about world events, I think I'd think twice before I said anything that could be construed as criticism of Putin. So you have to take those polls with a grain of salt. Now, having said that, I think the reaction in Russia is largely generational. I think the older generations are probably supportive of Putin simply because they've been conditioned longer to the government propaganda machine than have younger people who, by hook or by crook, gain access to the internet and know there's another world out there. And I think the number of people, the intelligentsia, that have fled Russia, and I would imagine the government's clamped down on that, is an indicator. People voting with their feet is an indicator of how many people in Russia really feel.
Absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly hard to really get an accurate picture of what is kind of the public consciousness in Russia right now. But nonetheless, I mean, we will see how this conflict progresses, and we will see how the world responds. Director Clapper, thank you very much for joining us today. Your insights and expertise are always very much appreciated. And so thank you, sir. Until next time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.